Hi, this is Mercedes Bern-Klug with the Global Aging class. Today is February 21st, 2020, and I have the privilege of speaking with Alex, who is going to introduce himself and talk a little bit about his job and his position and how he's understanding the issue of migration.
Hey everyone, my name is Alex. I'm right now doing a master's at the UNAM in Mexico City. I'm doing a master's in international relations, and I'm researching LGBTQ plus migration in Mexico's refugee system in general. And also, in addition to the schoolwork, I'm working at a nonprofit in Mexico City called Casa Refugiados. It's a nonprofit that focuses on facilitating integration processes, legal processes for folks who are applying for refugee status here in Mexico or who have refugee status here in Mexico. And within that work, we see lots of different folks from lots of different countries, lots of different situations, and yeah, that's more or less who I am and what I've been working on.
How long have you been at that position, Alex?
I've been at Casa de Refugiados for 1.5 years now, and also before working at Casa de Refugiados, I'd worked in a couple of NGOs in the U.S. that also worked with migrants and refugees.
All right, and at Casa, what would you say their mission is?
The mission is to, number one, create a sense of solidarity and a safe space for refugees and asylum seekers. A lot of times there's not a lot of information, and there's a lot of prejudice, of course, in any country. So one of the main goals is to kind of create that space where folks feel comfortable. And then once we get a sense of comfortability, right? The goal is to kind of make sure that people are able to find a job, people are able to network and to make friends, to get a legal document, right? Because that's also really, really important. And basically to be able to construct a new life here in Mexico. So the goal of the organization is really to try and facilitate those really important processes.
So you are working with people who are seeking asylum and people
Yes.
who are refugees
Yes,
directly.
so I've worked both on their legal team, and now I'm working on their integration team. So on the legal team, I mostly helped folks with their applications.
Okay.
Which is like a temporary green card. I also now work on the integration team. And on the integration team, we give workshops about finding a job, about education-related topics, and about getting to know Mexico City. So information about how to use the metro, how to the best street tacos to eat, everything like that to try and help people get.
Okay, you're freezing up just a little bit. So we're missing some of what you're saying. So I'm going to wait till you get unfrozen. Okay, here. Yeah, you were frozen for just a second. Sorry about that.
Okay.
All right. Can you give us a little bit of a background? The people you're working with have immigrated to Mexico. Where are they from?
So most of the folks that we're seeing are from Central American countries, El Salvador and Honduras primarily, and Guatemala a little bit less so, but still a pretty significant migration from Guatemala to Mexico. We also have a lot of people from Venezuela. The interesting thing about folks from Venezuela is that the acceptance rate for people who are applying for refugee status in Mexico from Venezuela is really, really high. It's about 99%. So a lot of people who are applying for refugee status from Venezuela are being resettled here. So it's become a really important flow of migration. We're also seeing an increasingly more diversified group of countries from which people come. So we've seen people from West Africa, from Southeast Asia. A couple weeks ago, I gave a workshop to a group of people from India who are applying for refugee status here in Mexico. We've seen people from Haiti and from Cuba. From a very wide range of countries. And also, interestingly, so Venezuela has a really high acceptance rate when it comes to refugee status. Central American countries, Haiti and Cuba, have lower acceptance rates, and West Africa and Southeast Asia have a little bit higher acceptance rates. So there's also a diversity in who's actually being granted refugee status, despite the fact that mostly everybody that we've talked to is coming from more or less the same situations where they're escaping violence, where they're escaping political persecution, where they're escaping discrimination. So it's interesting seeing both the diversity of countries and the diversity of ways that people from those countries are treated.
Can you tell us a little bit about the process of applying for asylum?
Yep, definitely. So the first step, of course, is arriving in Mexico. And once you arrive in Mexico, you have 30 days to submit an application to the COMAR, the Comisión Mexicana para Ayuda a los Refugiados, which is the commission that handles all of the applications for refugee status. So once that's been done, the La Comar will review your application. Theoretically, in 45 days, you'll hear a response whether or not your application has been accepted or denied. Within those 45 days, there's usually 1 or 2 interviews. They're very difficult interviews because sometimes you have to tell in grave detail the circumstances that you're fleeing from. So, you know, if you suffered domestic abuse or violence or that sort of thing, you have to be very clear with the people at Comad exactly what happened, and that can be really, really challenging. So in theory, this takes about 45 days for the application to be decided upon. But what we're seeing in practice is that because there have been a lot more people who have applied for refugee status in Mexico, the number has actually gone up from 2013 to 2019. It's gone up by over 5,000%. So we're seeing a huge increase in people who are applying for refugee status in Mexico, and that's created a lot of institutional issues. So in practice, we're seeing this 45 working day period being extended to anywhere from 6 months to 2 years as people are waiting for their application status. While they're applying for refugee status, they can apply for the Tarjeta de Visitante por Razones Humanitarias. It's a temporary residency card that you can renew every year. It gives you a work permit. It gives you basic access to social services, only for 3 months though. That's actually pretty much it. Those are really the only 2 things that you can get with it's nice because you get a work permit, right? And that's like a pretty progressive policy when you compare to other countries. But there's very little assistance aside from that. So it gives you a temporary status, but it's not the status that you get when you're granted refugee status, which is permanent residency status. And within 2 years, you can apply for citizenship after being granted permanent residency status via refugee status.
Oh, so that's huge. That's huge.
Yeah.
What are some of the common reasons that people are denied refugee status?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Unfortunately, it's pretty unclear because La Comar, they don't generally release information about the sorts of conditions that people use when they are applying. Mexico has a very wide definition of what it means to be a refugee. If you look at the 1951 protocol, for the 1951 convention relating to the status of refugees, there's 5 categories. It's persecution because of national origin, political beliefs, gender, membership in a particular social group, or religion. Mexico actually has extended that definition to include people who are fleeing generalized violence, internal conflict, and massive violations of human rights. Those are like the 3 extra categories that Mexico has added. So if you're applying for refugee status in Mexico, you can use any one of those conditions, any one of the conditions from the 1951 protocol, or any one of those expanded conditions. So a lot of folks from Venezuela, for example, mostly everybody's applying via generalized violence and internal conflict, and they're getting granted refugee status. Other folks from Central America are fleeing usually more targeted violence. So, you've been extorted, or you've been threatened by a criminal group. And so when they're applying for refugee status, they're citing those conditions. I would say people are generally denied because usually what La Comar, what most refugee agencies around the world cite when they deny an application is either they get the sense that you're fleeing for economic reasons and not for violence related reasons, or there's inconsistencies in your story. Those are the two major issues. Inconsistencies in your story is very, very complicated. And this I think gets into age a little bit as well, and a lot of other factors, because you have to tell a very cohesive narrative about what happened. And if there's any gaps, right? If you make a mistake, if you don't remember something perfectly, that could look bad in the eyes of somebody who's reviewing your application. So that I think is those 2 are the big reasons for getting denied refugee status. A lot of times, La Comar in Mexico, they don't really give a lot of evidence for why they're denying refugee status. It's not a funny case, but a really interesting case where a family from Haiti applied for refugee status. They all were fleeing from the same circumstances. The father was granted refugee status. The mother and the kids were not granted refugee status. And they appealed the case, and it turns out it was an administrative error, that they basically just made a mistake within La Comad. And if they hadn't appealed that case, if they hadn't been like this kind of bizarre, what would have happened is the father would have stayed and the family would have gotten deported. So there's it's anything from administrative issues to just like a vast misunderstanding of people's situations. And also, I think this issue of consistency within the narrative that you present is also definitely a grounds for getting your application denied.
Just from listening to that, it occurs to me that people with more formal education are probably at an advantage because they have had more experience with narrative and telling the story, and they can anticipate the kinds of questions.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that administrative issue with us, because that reminds us that sometimes it's not the story of the person seeking asylum, but it's the system that
Right.
can kind of also be a barrier and an impediment. All right, so you mentioned that people are not allowed to seek to become refugees based solely on economic need.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody was fleeing because of economics, what should they have done?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. Unfortunately, there's a big, both in the UN and in these international definitions, there's a really big divide between. It's a really gray area, because I'm part of the camp that believes that, economic migration is a form of exploitation, persecution, whatnot, right? And so I think, for me, it seems like a form of forced migration, which would imply the condition of being a refugee. So if somebody has not experienced direct violence in their home country, targeted violence, right? Especially if they're from a country like El Salvador or Honduras, what they could do is they could cite generalized violence. Even if the causes are primarily economic, they could make a case that because of generalized violence in their country, it's impossible to find a job, or if they were to have a job, they would be extorted, things like that. So, bless you. So I think for somebody who might not have experienced direct or targeted violence, using kind of that wider definition of generalized violence might be the way to go. A lot of people in Venezuela, for example, aren't fleeing direct political violence. They're fleeing, the results of a prolonged political conflict. And so, interestingly enough, despite the fact that a lot of folks from Venezuela are relatively well off, right? Because most of the people from Venezuela arrive by airplane, and they arrive with a visa, and then they apply for refugee status once they get to Mexico. So that implies, a series of economic and social privileges. Again, a lot of folks who arrive from Venezuela are still in vulnerable situations, but it does, there is, that aspect there. A lot of people from Venezuela are citing generalized violence as their claim for refugee status. So there is a way to kind of make a case, right? If the case kind of seems to be leaning more towards the economic migration side of things.
Thank you. You've provided a good background about the context of migrants in general, and I'm wondering now if we can focus a little bit on the situation facing older immigrants, people who are maybe 45, 50, 60 or older, seeking refugee status or coming as an immigrant. What do you see as some of the challenges facing that population?
Definitely, yeah. So I think there's a lot of challenges, and I think the three main areas are related to labor discrimination, or finding a job effectively, getting your transcripts revalidated here in Mexico, and also thirdly is the process of social integration, affective integration, getting a sense of community and getting a sense of emotional connection for your host community, and also creating social networks. So I'll start with labor, the labor side of things, because I think that's the thing that we see the most at Casa de Refugiados. There's a lot of age discrimination when it comes to the workforce in Mexico, and I would argue in virtually any country. I saw the same thing in my work in the U.S. as well. And it's especially difficult in Mexico because despite the fact that the Constitution and the refugee laws and the migration laws all basically say discrimination is illegal for age and for a number of other categories, these things still happen in practice. And there's not a lot of mechanisms or instruments to file a complaint in cases of age discrimination or any form of discrimination. So a lot of folks, right, they're applying for a lot of jobs. especially in the case of older folks. They're applying for a lot of jobs and they're not getting these jobs, or they get a job and they're treated differently because of their age. So the options that folks have are, number one, to just, as we say in Spanish, aguantar, right? To kind of just try and get over it, right? And keep working. Or the other option is to file a complaint. Filing a complaint is really complicated because it's a very long and difficult bureaucratic process. It's done through the Secretaría de Trabajo. There's a lot of documents involved. There's not a really good resolution rate. And also, there's the worry that by complaining or by voicing your concerns, you then become you're seen as not a compliant worker in the eyes of the employer. So that's a big issue. There's a lot of things that are keeping folks from filing complaints for these pretty obvious acts of age discrimination. And that's when folks have a job. The even before that is the numerous accounts of age discrimination that keep older folks out of the job market because of the prejudices that people have about what they're capable of. So that is definitely one of the things that we see the most, is finding a job. And we at Casa de Refugiados, we have a lot of partnerships with local businesses, local employment agencies, and we have a wide range of jobs. But what we definitely see is that the people who are getting those jobs are people in their 20s and 30s, regardless of education, regardless of a lot of other factors, right? Age is one of those factors that is pretty clear. So that's difficult. And when you don't have a job, when you're looking for a job, right, the other aspects of integration become even more complicated. Getting a sense of community. How can you do that if you're struggling to find a job? If you're struggling to keep a job? So it affects all these other aspects of integration. Another thing that's related to the labor market discrimination in finding a job in general is getting your studies revalidated. So in Mexico, a lot of the jobs require that you have la primaria, la secundaria, or la preparatoria, that you have middle school, grade school, and high school. If you don't have your documents, a lot of people don't have their middle school and grade school documents. I have no idea where mine are, for example. And that's okay, because you can take an exam here in Mexico. It's free and it's pretty accessible. You can take an exam basically to prove that you know all the things that you were taught in grade school, right? Things like addition and subtraction, not too difficult. If you don't have your high school transcripts, you can also take an exam, but that exam is a little bit more difficult. And you have to pay for it, and it's a little bit less accessible. They don't give the test out as often as they do with the validation test for preparatoria, for middle school and grade school. So it's one of those tests, it covers things like biology, things like writing, history, right? Things that maybe folks haven't seen, especially for older folks who haven't seen this material in 30, 40 years, right? You have to go back and you have to study it. And that can be difficult. Number one, if you're looking for a job and you don't have a lot of time to study for this exam, that obviously is an obstacle. And also, for a lot of other factors too. And so having to study for that exam, I think is challenging, and for older folks who are the people that are least likely to have their high school documents, they're the ones who are usually the most obligated to have to take that exam.
And I'm assuming it's all in Spanish.
Exactly. So for folks from West Africa, from Haiti, from East Asia, you have to have a high level of Spanish to be able to take these exams. So you need 6 months to a year to, number one, learn the language and then study for this exam. So there's also a language discrimination, and if you add that language discrimination onto the dimension of age discrimination, it becomes a nearly impossible task for a lot of people. So this issue with education is important too, because for example, I've met a lot of older folks from Venezuela who, when they were in Venezuela, spent 30, 40 years of their lives working an office job or a government job or a decently paid job. They left Venezuela sometimes in a hurry, not thinking really about their education document, not thinking that they, of course they have their passport and things like that, but not really thinking that they need to have their high school transcripts or their middle school transcripts. And they get to Mexico and they find out that they need this information. And in order to get the jobs that they're qualified for, they need to have this information, whether it's their high school transcript, their university transcripts, right? They need it with them and they don't have it with them. And then when they try and get that information from Venezuela, sometimes they luck out and their families have the documents and they can send them to Mexico. Other times, nobody has the document. And the only thing that you can do is, contact your university or contact the government. And the way Venezuela is right now, it's very, very difficult to navigate the government, both for political reasons. People are sometimes fleeing political violence, so they're not going to feel comfortable approaching the government, and also just the bureaucracy of everything that's happening in Venezuela. It can be very difficult to get these documents. So a lot of folks, and I think this disproportionately affects older folks, getting those documents revalidated is a really, really complicated process, and it keeps them from getting jobs that they would be qualified for in many cases.
Now, Alex, in this global aging class, we're usually talking about people as older adults at 60 and older, 65 and older, sometimes 70 and older. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming with employment, it's actually 40 and older. Would you say that being considered an older adult, I know in the United States, the age discrimination can be charged as of age 40. So are you seeing people in their 40s having a hard time getting a job?
Definitely. I think 40 is a good number. I think from 40 and onwards, and also I think a lot of it has to do with perception too. There's a lot of, I think, people look at somebody physically and they make a judgment about how old they are, even though they don't know their age. So there's that factor. There's that factor too. But yeah, I would say it probably starts around 40, mid 40s. It's in the Spanish, we always say like las personas de la tercera edad in Spanish, referring to people who I believe it's 60 and older. But I think that's a really good point. It definitely, in Casa de Refugiados, it definitely starts before that. Really like the prime age that people are looking to hire refugees for is, 20s and 30s.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about older people, older workers, people 40 and older, do you see a difference based on gender?
Yeah, definitely. So I think so the labor market in general in Mexico and a lot of countries throughout the world is very gendered, where there's a lot of stereotypes about jobs for men and jobs for women. So a lot, for example, when we give out a list of jobs, which we do after every workshop that we give about employment, there's a list of jobs that we've built partnerships with other businesses and organizations in Mexico City, and there's a number of cleaning jobs. And there's this idea, right, that a cleaning job is a job for women, which shouldn't first. I mean, to begin with, there's nothing wrong with the cleaning job, right? It can be a very dignified job. The issue is that people aren't paid a lot, and there's a lot of gender dynamics that are at play there. And also a lot of the cleaning jobs, the ones that we offer are formalized, but a lot of times people are finding informalized jobs in that sense. And so they're not getting paid well. They don't have access to health insurance. Oftentimes they're being exploited. And that's one of the gendered aspects of jobs that we're seeing. And so the conditions in general, the conditions for men and women refugees are not great when it comes to labor. No matter what sector it is, but there is definitely an element of gender, and I think this is one of the issues that I don't know as much about that I would like to know. I would like to know more about this issue, and I think it's one of the things that's the least studied, especially in the context of Mexico. And there needs to be a lot more research about this particular area, the gender dynamics of finding a job, and also the gender dynamics of a lot of other things, social integration, right? How gender is a really important factor, and how that is a compounded factor when it comes to discrimination. So, a lot of times when we talk about discrimination in Casa de Refugiados, we talk about like a double discrimination or sometimes a triple discrimination. Because number one, you're going to be discriminated against because you're not from Mexico. There's a lot of xenophobia. If you have any other condition on top of that, if you're a member of the LGBTQ+ community, a woman, a persona de la tercera edad, right? These are all factors that compound and create different and more difficult to navigate forms of discrimination. So I think gender is one of those factors that you could add on to, the base factor of not being Mexican, then the factor of age, and then the factor of gender, and these compound and make entering the labor force even more difficult.
So you've talked about the barrier of actually getting documentation to prove and validate one's education, 1 years of experience, and especially when people are fleeing conflict and their government is in disarray, it might not even be possible to get those documents at all. Right. And then the age discrimination. And you also had mentioned when we spoke earlier that the whole issue about getting your documents validated is particularly an issue for older adults because it's been so long since they were in school or so long since they had those documents, and they might be harder to get even if the country wasn't in disarray.
Exactly.
And then the issue of gender and gender identity and how those can compound and make it more difficult for people to get a job. And then how also getting a job is related to social integration. So feeling that sense of community that you say is, and I agree, is so completely important for migrants to begin to feel that they belong in this new society for them. So I'm looking back, we're coming to the end of our time a little bit. So it sounds like social integration, we need a lot more research on what can receiving countries do to assist immigrants with social integration, building that sense of community. The whole issue about validation of documents so that people can arrive here, and then when they get their refugee status, can actually become eligible to, they can prove that they're eligible to get work. And then even if you have all that, there's the issue of age discrimination. And people as young as in their 40s having a difficult time being considered desirable employees.
Right.
Well, you are doing some very important work, and your organization is doing some really important work with people at an extremely vulnerable time of their life. And I want to thank you for your years of dedication to this population and to these issues. And I want to thank you also for sharing your expertise with these students in the global aging class. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we conclude the interview?
Yeah, I think I would just end by saying that this is definitely an area within migration studies that is totally undercovered, and there needs to be a lot more research, especially in the context of Mexico. Right? There's studies. There's a number of studies in the context of the U.S. because there's been a history of migration to the U.S. for years. But in Mexico, people who are choosing to stay in Mexico is a relatively new phenomenon. So there's a lot of areas of interest that should be addressed, and I think one of those, and one of the most underaddressed, is the factor of age. And a lot of NGOs too. A lot of people who work in NGOs in Mexico City and probably in other parts of Mexico too. A lot of the employees are younger people. Most of the people that I work with are people in their 20s. So I think we oftentimes miss the factor of age, and I think it's something that needs to be brought into academic studies and also to activism work as well.
Alex, thank you so much for making time to talk with us, and good luck to you with your studies and also with your career.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking with you.
I'm going to stop the recording.